the Blake-Feyerabend hypothesis, Timb Hoswell. And at first, I was quite interested in it. I, thought it was challenging and chewy. But as the day has gone on, just without even thinking about it, I've got more grumpy. And the grumpiness, if I can put my finger on it, is that I think he's been dishonest with us. I think he's playing a little bit of a game with us. I wouldn't mind someone philosophizing in a way that disagreed with me honestly, but, and I'll come to this in due course, I think there's a few sleight of hand, fast dealing, some little mistakes there that make me feel that the vocabulary is fraudulent. And I'm very sensitive to this in philosophy generally. My feeling is if a philosopher knows what they're talking about, they're a good communicator. And if they are bullshitting, they're an obfuscator. So my alarm bells rang a little bit at the start, but then he actually has, I'm not pushing that position because one or two words aside, he generally wrote pretty clearly. But anyway, so his big idea is that he coins the idea of the Cartesian quandary, which has a kind of equivalent, not just for Cartesians, but for Darwin. And the Cartesian quandary is that the scientific atheist can only be right by taking God as his as his premise. So it's an irony here that they're an atheist and yet they need God to be a scientific atheist. And how does he arrive at this conclusion? Well, even without knowing anything about his background, as soon as I saw the argument, I thought this is just Anselm's ontological proof for God, and it's circular. So Anselm says something like this: a fool can imagine a perfect, all-powerful God, but an actual all-powerful God is greater than the imagined one. So coming back to the fool, clearly he didn't get it right because is only imaginary. The original concept was wrong, and therefore the idea that God is only imaginary is wrong, and therefore he's real. And this has amused philosophers for 800 years. Kant, I think it was, put it to bed when he said it assumes that existence is a good thing, and if you don't have that assumption, then you don't, the thing lacks any kind of power. So his Cartesian quandary, I think, is of a similar kind of sleight of hand. And I don't mind that because it's good to kind of think, well, why am I objecting to it? What I do mind is later on in his own book, he refutes his own Cartesian quandary, and he's not, that's what I mind. And we'll get to that. But so let's just try and do his Cartesian quandary some justice here. Yeah, he quotes Descartes, and it's a slightly muddled quote because it's got one of these kind of negative. Right, so Descartes on his first meditation says, if there is no God, the probability of my being so imperfect so as to be the constant victim of deception will be increased exactly in proportion as the power possessed by the cause to which they assign my origin is lessened. So what I think he means by the power possessed by the cause to which they assign my origin is science. He lived before Darwin, but that's what he's groping towards. So in proportion as Darwinism, let's say, is lessened, then I have to be more and more of a victim of deception.
Sorry, more and more?
A victim of constant deception. The chances of me being deceived all the time, my senses deliberately being, fooled, increases the weaker the explanatory power of Darwinism. I think I've got that right. Although it's, it's slightly slippery the way it's worded. And the context is that Descartes has reached the point where he's wondering, does God exist? Now, he actually thinks God does exist, but he's raised the question because if he strips everything away, how can he trust anything? And his answer is, well, a good God doesn't deceive. And because Descartes doesn't want to deny God, he enters into this twisty logic of, right, so the level of, without God, there's a level of deception that's going to rise in proportion to the atheistic theories losing power. Now, I think Hoswell doesn't have it that way round. I think he has it the other way around. He says, I think Hoswell's argument thinks that Descartes is saying the more cognition is from natural causes, not God, the less valid our knowledge.
That's well, I think what he's arguing is that if you accept that your reason is a powerful instrument, because God gave it to you in order to properly apperceive the world, then the evidence of your senses is reliable because your reason and you're equipped to understand the world because God gave you that. So his argument is that that's the pathway that Descartes sends us down. You know, these original meditations are, you know, what is reliable, what isn't. And he talks about an evil genius could be fooling us. So he tries to settle on what's reliable, and that forms the foundation of his work. It's fine. Hoswell's argument, as far as I understood it, was that that's fine, but where we ended up with that reason that we trust is in disproving God. So through the Enlightenment, we used the reason which had been legitimized by belief in God. We then ran with that reason and we trusted it when it disproved God. And there's your quandary for anyone in that position. So what is the foundation of knowledge now, or, you know, or understanding in the absence of God underwriting it? And so that's the whole, as I say, quandary that he directs his work towards and that he wants to address.
I think you did his Cartesian quandary some justice there, and you expressed it well. But can you see why I sort of felt like it was like this circularity of the ontological proof? Because it only feels like a contradiction if you're committed to the premise that
I disagree with that because
God.
So when I first read it, I was put out in much the same way as you. There's something very tricksy about this. It's like, you know, it's not giving you the full picture. But the more I thought about it, actually, that is a good description of how we got to where we are. You know, we went from, you know, God underwrote the check, you know, which got the Enlightenment launched, and then the Enlightenment cut God free. And that does leave you with an awful hole. And I know that's true because we've been trying to fill it ever since. So, you know, there's no, we're nowhere, I want to say that we're nowhere nearer a solution to that problem of underwriting knowledge, in particular scientific knowledge of the world. So hence him bringing in Feyerabend. So for those who don't know him, Feyerabend, as I said, was a German philosopher at Berkeley. But famously, he described his own approach to scientific methodology. He described described himself as an epistemological anarcho-Dadaist, which I've always loved, being a fan of anarchism and Dadaism. And I used to correspond with Feyerabend when I was at university. Very briefly, it was more like a exchange, you know, fan mail really than a substantive philosophical engagement. But nevertheless, I wrote to him a few times, and I used his work as the basis for some of my own work at college. The point, without going too deep into Feyerabend, as indeed Hoswell doesn't go very deep into Feyerabend, certainly not so far. But the point about Feyerabend is that he believes there is no single method for underwriting scientific progress. So he's writing there contra people like Popper, falsificationists, and so on. And he is for a Dadaistic approach, a sort of anything goes, which is a good criticism of the positive methodological proposals, principally those, you know, related to Popper. But it has nothing positive to say in itself. Nothing, you know, what is the origin? Okay, let's there's a sort of man proposes, nature disposes kind of approach. The ideas can come from anywhere, would be Feyerabend's point of view. You could get those ideas by, I don't know, taking drugs, getting whacked out, or as we discussed last week, looking at other modes of thought and just stealing ideas maybe from Buddhism or whatever. You can get your ideas from wherever you like. That doesn't justify them. Justifying them as, you know, a separate thing. But they're not derived directly from the evidence. So I rather approve of that view.
Right. Except that I'm going to jump ahead to the to where I started to really get cranky. So, except that Hoswell then it gets into a discussion of Blake and Blake versus Hume, right? And says this. In claiming that we have knowledge beyond human limitations, he says, clearly we do perceive objects, forces, entities, and states of affairs, even if what we perceive can't be reduced or conceived of in sensory terms. So he's defending, quite rightly, Blake's idea that we can have knowledge of things that isn't simply sensory. There's other levels, and including sort of intuition and feeling and so on, which is Mark Soames again. But then he says this, right? Even if at some future point a brilliant scientist discovers a way to reconceptualize these basic forces, the basic fact of the matter is these forces really do exist, and we perceive of them, and the way we do it is in non-sensory ways. So I think that is actually correct. But it completely undermines his Cartesian quandary, because he's saying there is knowledge, and that's
why does that undermine? No, the quandary is that if you don't believe in God, how do you underwrite it? He does. So
yeah.
and so does Blake. So you know it will later transpire that the God's role in this new process, as described by Hoswell, is that God is essentially the body of the imagination. Blake describes the body of Christ as the imagination. So the imagination becomes almost identical with God in Blake. And there is your power for creating new concepts. What he then does, and this is something actually, so Feyerabend's best known book is a kind of high level summary of his views and against method. But in the collections of his essays, he, for example, argues that, in a sense, Newtonianism is a special case of the Einsteinian, you know, post-Newtonian physics, so to say. It's not a complete contrary to it.
No.
And this is compatible with what Hoswell is saying about how Newton dreams up, through the power of the imagination, ironically, a method for seeing the world. And frankly, some of these ideas I kept thinking when Hoswell was talking about them, these products of the imagination which structure what we see, they're synthetic a priori as far as I could gather, as in Kant, in that you know, they become the sort of foundation of science, not quite a priori in the strict logical sense, but in the Lakatoshian sense that within any scientific discipline, with any research program, there are fundamental principles which don't get challenged once they're established. They're the premises from which you proceed. And some of these intuitions that might be the product of the imagination create those kind of principles, as in Newton. And then we see the world through Newtonian eyes, not just in terms of error. And then when somebody else with a different imagination produces another model, the Newtonian model is superseded, but we don't consign it to the dustbin. For me, it would be an error to say Newton was wrong.
Yes.
So I think that's what Hoswell is getting at.
No, he absolutely is getting it. And I agree with it 100%. But I don't see how that's consistent with saying that the Darwin and scientific atheism are in a mess. Because, in fact, the scientific atheist, of which I would be one, and I'm not a new atheist, but I'm there's no room for God in my, I don't need that hypothesis. What you've just said about how you can recast the information that we're experiencing with different intuitions, that's how I feel knowledge works and science works, and it's not a quandary because I never. I'm going to say those of us who are scientific atheists didn't posit I can see this quandary only works because you are looking at a pre-Descartian way of doing science, which does have a room for God, and then it goes into disproving God, and therefore it seems to be a contradiction. But if you're growing up in a generation that hasn't had God as the premise, as the foundation for your knowledge, but then there's still, I think there's still scope for talking about imagination versus kind of populism. There's still scope for talking about Blake versus Hume and siding with Blake without feeling that you're in a quandary, without feeling that the foundation of your system was ever God.
I think the problem with that is that the reason you feel quite confident about that is you've spent so many years, almost all your life, not noticing that structure has no foundation. The reason he keeps talking about Darwinism is not because of the great Scopes debate or anything like that, but because what Darwin shows is that man evolved, part of the general pattern of evolution. And therefore, the implication is that our senses and our brain is simply an adaptation to our environment. It's not a tool for contemplating the truths of the universe. And there is your fundamental problem from Hoswell's point of view. There is nothing in modern science, especially after Darwin, that tells you that the mind is anything other than, well, whatever it is, useful, certainly in many ways. And of course, at the dawn of the Enlightenment, you could say it's fantastically useful because all of a sudden we've got, all of the tools and techniques that the Enlightenment and, the early modern period and the scientific revolution gave us. But you might want to be more skeptical about that these days. You might want to say it's also produced, those massive floods in Germany today, wildfires down, the eastern coast of America, Canada, and so on and so forth. The destruction of the environment. Has our science really given us this technical control of nature? It's clearly given us some insight into, details here, but we used to think that the logic of those details would lead us towards some ultimate understanding of nature. And I think what this guy Hoswell is saying is that there is no reason to suppose that, and there's nothing in modern science or philosophy to justify that position. But there is in Blake. If you use Blake to shore up, as it were, Feyerabend, and what Feyerabend, so I think his notion is that he supports Feyerabend's criticism of Popper and by extension all methodologies, all scientific methodologies. But he wants to use Blake to shore up and give a positive account of why that is the case through Blake's concept of the imagination as being prior to reason. And reason itself, what appears within science and within a scientific research paradigm, you could say, or program, what appears within the program is, if you like, a reification of that imagination, a snapshot of it in process, as it were. And that snapshot is the product of godlike imagination. But referring back to our conversation last week, is also a barrier to the further development of science. If you remember, we were talking about that Buddhist idea of people clinging on to ideas even when they're right, and that being a barrier. That would be a barrier to the further development of the imagination. I'll only say one more thing at this point, which is that the other thing I was very, very powerfully reminded of was when we were reading Gregory Bateson. And Bateson talked about the ontology, the difference between mind and matter. He said they're not two different substances. It's that, when we look at things from the point of view of being matter, matter is limited. He puts it negatively, mind is infinite, because even the absence of something can make a difference in the mind. My girlfriend didn't turn up. She hates me, sort of thing. And so the mind contains an infinity, whereas matter is finitely limited. And I was very struck when I read that in Bateson, But I was also struck in reading Hoswell how much that applies to what he's saying about Blake's notion of infinity as being at the core of Blake's concept, and of the imagination being what drives you, can take you through this infinity, infinite potential, if you like, and sloughing off finite things, descriptions of particular states of matter, premises, for research programs and so on and so forth. Locke is savaged by Blake quite correctly over this idea. One of the really good things about this Hoswell pamphlet, among there's quite a few good things. One of them is it really draws attention to some of Blake's earliest works. There is no natural religion, and I've always thought of Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell as his manifesto, from which he then goes on to elaborate all of his great artistic works and so on. But I thought Hoswell really usefully drew attention to these earliest works where Blake is very explicitly engaging with, Lockean and related, empiricist concepts of the foundations of science or of knowledge, as he would put it, being purely natural in nature.
Coming back to the separation of true knowledge from engineering knowledge, once you've introduced that separation, well, of course, you've cut the ground under my feet. I can't advocate for one paradigm having any more value than another if I'm not allowed to do any engineering. It's just aesthetics, which is taking Feyerabend to the NES plus ultra. So I reject that. It's clever, but it suits a purpose rather than a real insight. I think all paradigm shifters with great imagination were simultaneously engineers, in the sense that Hoswell means. If you think about Einstein or Kepler or any of them, they're all tinkering all the time. Newton. Let's have a look at this, the Darwin argument. We haven't mentioned it yet, and I think it will help me rally my cause a little bit. So Hoswell asked the question, is there a hierarchy to evolutionary understanding? If you go from a goldfish to a rat to a human, are they higher levels of understanding? And of course, the scientist says, yes, they are. The human's great. And then Hoswell says, aha. So what's next? And if there is something higher, how pitiful is the human understanding going to look from that higher perspective? And therefore, we have to appreciate that our current knowledge is flawed. But the conclusion he draws from it is different to the conclusion I would draw from that thought. So the conclusion he draws from that thought is there is no hierarchy in nature. If he means by that we're evolving towards, a sort of Hegelian collective kind of universal self-realization, well, yeah, fair enough. It's not Darwinian, isn't about that. But if he's saying that therefore, there's no difference between the models of the universe of a rat and a goldfish and a human, well, that's going too far, because clearly there is.
But there are differences, but why are they important differences? I don't think he's saying there aren't differences. I think what he's saying is that we could say there are certain qualitative differences, say between, the way humans are structured and conceive of things, let's say, or possibly, experience things and so on and so forth, to a rat. But there's no innate hierarchy there. I mean, evolution is.
Well, this is where you have to. This is where you see, if you don't have any tinkering with the environment, then there isn't a hierarchy. But clearly, humans are more effective at tinkering with their surroundings.
So it doesn't mean that they have a better access to truth. I mean, clearly, that's what we're trying to establish, is what constitutes truth here. And the fact that humans have destroying the planet isn't really great evidence that they're have a better understanding of it. For example, so you have a real problem there, which is that the technique is better, but it doesn't mean that we have access to truth, in a way that other animals do.
Okay, well, how? So would you say that the rat's intuition of the sun is as truthful as a human's
intuition of
the sun.
Oh,
you know, presumably a rat is aware of the sun, probably has a sense of cycles, day and night. But it would be. But I imagine it's a hard thing to do. But I imagine it's quite a limited chemical kind of feeling. Oh, that's nice and warm. Oh, it's dark. You know, I don't know. And whereas humans have had loads of different theories about the sun, starting with the idea that it's a god, and now having an idea that it's a nuclear explosion in a vacuum. And are you saying that these, from the perspective of what is truth, there's nothing to choose between the rats or the human ones?
From the perspective of what is truth, no, I don't think there is particularly. I mean, it's hard for me to judge because I have absolutely no idea what a rat thinks about it. But I think we can safely say none of us have any idea about what it's like to be another animal. But as Blake said, who are you to say that every bird that cuts the airy way, I can never remember the end of this quote, but the nub of it is that who are you to say that it isn't full of the most amazing visions of eternity and, in its own terms? And I've long found that completely persuasive. I don't find, and I mean, there are many reasons to think that humans are so I'm not becoming anti-human here. I'm a humanist, but I would say that rats have less need of psychologists, for example. Rats didn't develop a civilization that depended on them working their asses off day in, day out, every day, completely unnecessarily, and giving themselves broken hips and arthritis and all these things that are completely self-inflicted wounds, as they say in the military. You get put in, if you have a self-inflicted wound in the military, you go to Jankers, basically. If you turn up to the doctors, that includes venereal diseases. That's considered a self-inflicted wound. Humanity is full of these self-inflicted wounds. So whatever humanity is well adapted to do, it isn't necessarily well adapted to looking after itself or people or whatever. But I think we could go around the
Is it a hopeless project then to want to come closer to the truth of the universe?
No, the exploration of the imagination, which is the Blakean idea, is far from a hopeless project. It's a realistic thing to want to do, but we don't need to speculate about the future of humanity here, other than to accept, I think, what Hoswell says is that it is not difficult to imagine species living on other planets who have evolved a far greater. One of the things, when people talk about artificial intelligence, I think most of what's talked about is nonsense. But one thing I've always thought about it is that if machines could think, which of course, well, there wouldn't be machines, but if something fabricated could think, which is very plausibly the case, then it might be able to think much more than us if it had different senses, if it was sensitive to lots more aspects of the universe, and sensitive perhaps to a much wider range of things, further away, to the pressure at the bottom of the ocean, to, whatever it is. And since beings with far more senses than us are possible, and more than just our five senses as well, by the way, and with a wider range of perception within those senses, it's perfectly possible that there are creatures with far greater, whatever it is you think humans have.
Oh, I wondered how you get out of this, finishing that sentence.
They're going to have a lot more of it. Thus taking us back to Hoswell's problem, which is how do we justify saying that we've got such great access to reality, truth, to truth. And again, philosophically, Blake provides a way of around that problem by bringing God back in as imagination. It's no more bizarre than Descartes' argument that starts with God. We're doing the same thing here. I think Hoswell wants to do the same thing, start with God. It's a different concept of God, but nevertheless, there you go. So it is a concept.
Okay, but
God is the ground of being there, by the way, of the in that Bateson-type distinction between finitude and infinitude, God as the location of the infinite, which implies infinite potential and infinite development, or at least a possibility of it.
So on what grounds do you pick your models, your
methodologies? I mean, again, one thing I did, referring to something you said earlier there, when by criticizing the engineering point of view, I wasn't criticizing engineering, far be it from me as an engineer to want to know that, but the engineering view of truth, which is if it works, it's true. That's what I'm denigrating. Now, everybody knows, most people know, that Newton got, he was deeply interested in engineering, principally the key engineering problems of his time, which were getting water out of mines, pumping it out of mines in order to clear mines for mining, the location of ships at sea, and weaponry, how to fire a cannonball and predict where it would land. These are all engineering problems that he faced, and he meditated on those problems. Well, studied them and meditated on them, and he produced his great insight of his concept of gravity. So it's not to denigrate the engineering, but it's to say the insight that he had isn't justified by the fact that he got to fire, on the basis of his mechanics, you can fire a cannon more accurately. That doesn't prove the truth of it. It's an interesting side effect.
I think you and Hoswell demand too much, and it made it difficult for you to even speak of progress. I don't think you can have a concept of progress at all in the way you're talking, and it still begs the question of is the difference between Einstein and Newton simply an aesthetic one?
It's an interesting question. In terms of truth, I think it is an aesthetic one. They're just on the basis of the raw theory. I mean, clearly, Einstein's theories had far greater explanatory power. I mean, one person who really is missing from all this, and I don't think he solves any of the problems here, but it's interesting to consider him, is Lakatos, who took falsificationism and gave it, an acceptable face by talking about how actual scientific research programs, but also they accumulate anomalies, i.e. data that doesn't fit the model. And according to Lakatos, these programs compete with one another. So, for example, there's no point in rejecting an explanation of the world if there isn't a better one at hand. You can have as many anomalies as you like, but you're just going to have to accumulate anomalies without those things. So all of these things I'm saying are true. The anomalies, the predictive power of the core hypotheses, the reactionary function of what he called the auxiliary hypotheses, which exist only in order to defend core hypotheses. Is there anything to choose between, how would you choose between the Newtonian and Einsteinian one? Well, in fact, the answer there is sociological. People chose the Einsteinian one because it solved a lot of the anomalies of the Newtonian system. It made novel predictions which turned out to be true, and so on and so forth. But there's your engineering solution. Science voted for Einstein based on kind of engineering outputs. It was better at X, Y, and Z. At no point has anyone given a satisfactory explanation for any sense in which Einstein is more true than Newton.
Right.
Deeply true than Newton.
But, and we've talked about this a long time, perhaps even our first video. I think the first might have been Dylan, but the second one, Epiphany. And yet, right, there's a sense in which an idea can feel right, and I think that's important. I can imagine a scenario where a person with a barbarian philosophy has a better insight into truth. You triggered this thought in me when you were scoffing at the state of the world today, because it reminded me, I was just reading today about Alaric and his advance on Rome, and he sacked Rome in 410. He was kind of pushed into doing it. And one of Terry Jones from the Monty Python provocatively said that this is just propaganda that he sacked Rome. And Terry Jones is kind of right, because Rome was so despicable at the time that not only did thousands of slaves rise up, and not only did they let Alaric in, but so did a lot of Romans. They would rather live with the barbarians than in freedom than under the tax of the Romans. And there's one in particular who was interviewed, and his interview has survived the centuries, where he said, "It's just great. It's I'm more free, and I like that." I didn't use these exact words, but I like the downtime. In between the wars, I just like hanging out with them, feeling safe. He said, "I didn't ever feel safe when I was a Roman." So this is sort of getting a bit circular, but I can quite see that that there are choices to be made in our knowledge, and it might be a struggle to make truth claims about them, but it's not a struggle to say this is for me. When you get Einstein, when it drops, it's so different and so brilliant that you just think, yeah, this is I'm going to become a fan for the rest of my life, And with Lakatos as well, I think isn't the idea that as well that you can have these out of favor streams, or maybe I think of Thomas Kuhn, that are a bit bizarre by the mainstream standards, but precisely because of that bizarreness, have the answers to some of these anomalies as you're talking about them. I think Bateson said something similar as well, actually, that evolution has to work like this. It has to contain all the variants for the best variant to be picked. And I think that might be true for scientific ideas, that the out of favor ones that only a few people are still doing can suddenly colonize the rest.
Well, they don't have to be. The plurality there doesn't have to be a plurality of scientific ideas. There's a plurality of ideas and concepts and ways of looking at the world. So the intuition, it's not only true that you have those important moments of breakthrough when you grasp a new way of looking at the world or create a new way of looking at the world, but it's absolutely enshrined in our concept of what science is. So, Eureka, Archimedes.
Yeah.
Oh, and this is part of how we conceive science, and quite correctly as well. But there are artistic moments. So aesthetics is really involved here. When you suddenly, aesthetics in the sense you have a feeling for a new totality, a gestalt, or something like that. The prejudice of, you gave your example of Alaric. Amazingly, some people want to go with Alaric. It's true also of, when the British were thrown out of India, amazingly, some Indians didn't miss the British. It's quite astonishing, this advanced culture, they didn't at all see it as a step backward, losing the British Empire. It's not, it all depends who's telling the story.
Right.
I was reminded this week of a book. So the question here is, does our increasing technique, in itself, or not even in itself, does it somehow, or is it the basis for establishing the greater truth of our proposals and our ideas about the world? I don't believe it is, and I don't believe it proves our conceptual system at all. I was reminded this week of a book that I haven't read for over 20 years, but I just ordered a copy of it to read it again, which is a book that asks the question, I can't remember how it answers it, to be honest. But it asks the question, it considers the area around Los Alamos, where the atomic weapons were first developed by the Americans. And in that geographical area, it considers the mythologies of the native people, the Native Americans of that region. And it asks the question, could we have developed an adequate science, adequate to building a bomb, if we'd have started with the mythologies and very different concepts of time and place and so on, but if we'd have started with the mythologies of the local, the native people, as opposed to the mythologies of the ancient Greeks.
Yeah.
And my persuasion is that we could.
Absolutely could.
You know,
Absolutely could. I'm really convinced of that because my recent work on the Babylonians, because they evolved from talking about their gods and having systems for they had sort of prophylactic measures that you could take when the omens indicated something bad would happen. But at one point, one of them's asked, when the sun appears weak, diminished, discolored, what measure should we take? I said, oh, we can't do anything about that. And because I know that you can't, when a massive volcano erupts, which might have been the cause of a blue sun, a diminished sun, the dust, there's nothing anybody can do to stop a cold winter coming the next year. So you, even using their language of gods, and gods to whom they didn't exactly have human sacrifice, but they came pretty close to it by putting substitutes for the ill omens.
You know, I don't want to press this idea because you know how skeptical I am of the idea, for example, that Buddhism preempts quantum mechanics. But let's say perhaps one of the problems that the Western mind, again, I'm devil's advocate here. Don't anyone quote me on this. But perhaps one of the problems the Western mind has in understanding the findings of quantum mechanics is that they're counterintuitive to our native concepts of time and space. Perhaps if modern physics had developed on the basis, in Tibet, for the sake of argument, people would have found it a lot easier to understand, the simultaneous being and non-being of a cat. They might not find it such a gross offence to their common sense. It's at least conceivable, i.e., that there are different issues here going on here. One is to do with the adequacy of our science to explaining the world. But in one sense, our science is adequate to explaining quantum mechanics. We've got the math that does it. But in another sense, it isn't, in the sense that nobody understands it intuitively. And maybe that's just a problem with our conceptual system. Maybe occupying a different point in Blake's infinitude of forms, we would have a spontaneous understanding of what was being said, perhaps.
In Marx's day, the issue was integration, because Newton, as opposed to Leibniz, had a method for integration that was you have a curve, you build a triangle, you bring that triangle down until you get d2y over d2x, and then you say, oh, well, they're naught over naught, so you can ignore them. And this was giving mathematicians and physicists a real headache, because, well, can you ignore the naught over naught? Okay, it's tiny, but it's not robust. It didn't feel right. And there was a big prize, financial prize, for the person who could explain how calculus worked without having to just put a red pen through. At this point, dy. What
do you think about that? Is that now? It reminds me of something.
Well, Marx kind of solved it, and the answer is to think of it as well. He said it's not. It isn't any naught over naught. It's not the infinite. It's not the infinity of naughts over naughts that the cold logician says. The way Marx said it was, he tried to win the prize. He didn't get it right. But Marx said it's naught over naught with a history. Each one has come to the point with a history, and therefore it isn't arbitrary.
This is very it's an argument, but what
what does it mean?
So is history doing in mathematics? It's a very unusual. It sounds problematic to me. Actually, it doesn't sound very satisfying at all to say, history explains this. This zero's got a history. No,
but he's right. Well, and he had some maths to prove it. I have the book. And someone wrote a book about Karl Marx's maths.
This is what all science is like, though. We proceed, from one theory to the next, one paradigm to the next, and everything is neat and tidy in retrospect. But as we know, I can't remember. Was it Feyerabend who wrote about the Michelson-Morley experiment? Who first got me interested?
No, it was Thomas Kuhn.
Was it? Was it Kuhn? Yeah. Okay, but that notion that, I mean, that's probably not a good example because that's along the lines of almost fraud and deceit in the halls of science kind of stuff. But nevertheless, conceptually, so we're not talking about fraud here or let's make a clear distinction here. We're not talking about the kind of fraud which is sometimes committed in science. Yeah. People get results in order to get, to prove what they want to prove. We're not talking either about the, slight economy with the truth when it comes to writing the history of science, which is what is the case with the Michelson-Morley experiments, in which they're written up. For those who don't know, the Michelson-Morley experiments were to test the theory of Einstein's theory and to test the existence of an ether, an objective space, so to say. They are, almost every physics textbook today tells you that they showed that no such space existed, and they found no existence of the ether. But in fact, that's not what they found at the time, and the results at the time were considered highly controversial. But that's a case of tidying up the history.
Where we're disagreeing is, it's this question of our relationship to truth. Because it still seems a bit vague to me that, but I'm interested in the idea that, okay, so you're saying there's no engineering approach to truth, but there is an imaginative approach.
Hegel has an idea here, which is, dialectics, negation, thesis, antithesis, and all this kind of thing. It's kind of interesting, actually, because the author Hoswell makes a snide remark about Hegel. He says, well, it's all very well, but where is this antithesis coming from?
Oh, yeah, that's
I thought it was an excellent point, because it's a sort of point that Hegel made about Schelling. There's something post hoc about, describing all these theses and antitheses. And at the back of it all, anyway, is God. It's always been quite I mean, Marx's response to Hegel has long dissatisfied me in a way that isn't terribly original. But the idea that you can just turn Hegel on his head to get materialism, Hegel's system does rather rely on the dialectic being God. I mean, that's what lends it the authority of, the totality is God. There's no God separate to that. But, you're talking about the totality here. And you can't do that in materialism. And that, I think, is another example of where Hoswell would insert his knife and say, God, Hegel can kind of get away with this because his system starts with God. He's got God on his side. His system starts with God. But Marx and the modern materialists can't really, because all they've got is theses, proposals, and data, and then I don't even know. Whenever I read about scientific methodology, I don't hear anyone mentioned who wasn't being mentioned 30 years ago. I'm not aware. Perhaps there's some really exciting stuff being done by. It seems to me there's been no real progress, and I think Feyerabend pretty much blew the gaff anyway. He pretty much showed that it's rigged. The whole game is rigged, and there's no reason to have a single methodology.
Now,
again, a methodology is a way of approaching truth, or let's say it's a way of approaching consensus. And if you look at Lakatos describes how to adequately approach or dispute scientific consensus, and I think that's a reasonable conclusion.
Do you agree with Hoswell's use of Blake in this regard? And so he's especially Blake versus Hume. And we should spell this out a little bit. So, so there's the series A, little pithy observations by Blake, and series A seems to be all the Humean ones. Am I right? So he sets out that we can only know what's come to us through our senses, for example, is one of about 10. And then series B, or series 2, is saying the exact opposite to Hume every time. It's really wonderful how he, does that.
So this is a couple of things about Hoswell. The context here. I thought his presentation was scrappy. I thought there were holes in what he said. I thought there was enough, but I thought he was trying to do wasn't just valuable. I thought he was right. Again, I said something last week about how it's gratifying when science confirms your prejudices. It's also gratifying when other philosophers confirm your prejudices. I pretty much agreed with where he was going with this. What I thought was novel in what he did was really drawing attention to Blake's early work. Principally, there is no natural religion. The emphasis here is on natural. I'm saying natural religion. He's talking about deism. He's talking about the idea that you can derive truth from nature through natural causes. So what it does in There Is No Natural Religion is have a series of propositions which sum up, it's actually the Lockean position. And then he blows them apart. And he shows that the Lockean position leaves you, in a sense, leaves knowledge going around in circles without the imagination to go beyond what has been
just unpick that, because there'll be people wanting to know how do you blow the Lockeans apart? What does he do exactly to?
So what the nub of it is that what Locke argues is that anything you can know can only be derived essentially from your senses. Your sort of internal senses play a role here. So feelings of anger and whatever, and a sort of mental process of correlating sense data. So you get sense data and you correlate. Now, Blake utterly, totally opposed this, not as a matter of detail, but in a fundamental way. And what we're saying is one of his very first publications starts by trying to blow Locke out of the water. This is important, by the way, in terms of the Higgs book, which we talked about a few weeks ago. Higgs tries to describe Blake's view of the world by starting with Locke and saying, our minds are blank, we get sense data. It's the most astonishing thing. He doesn't even notice that Blake is completely at loggerheads with empiricism and Locke. The Lockhead, whatever. So the point that Blake tries to make, I almost just want to read Blake because There Is No Natural Religion is extremely short. It's a few pages. But he starts off by saying, man cannot naturally perceive but through his natural or bodily organs. This is the hypothesis of Locke. You can only he's right about this, by the way. He's saying you can only naturally perceive. So he's limiting it to nature. This is part of something I've commented on previously about Blake's hostility to nature. He's sort of saying that Locke is only correct if you limit yourself to nature, because you can only naturally perceive through your sense organs. But he tries to do a sort of reductio of that empiricist outlook by saying that if that's true, you will just end up going round in circles. For example, you can't, if you haven't, you can't predict the existence of something you've never experienced, would be one of the implications of that, because you can't imagine it. It's never been in your experience, so you can't generalize from it. And what Blake argues is that you can, because of this divine power of the imagination. So you have more than just your senses through which to understand the world. Somewhere in the middle of this is a famous dispute about what is the nature of imagination. So I can't remember if Locke or Hume talks about how you can use your imagination to take elements of what you have experienced and put them together in a fantastic way to produce an idea of something that you have never experienced as such. Let's take a trivial example: a chimera, an animal with the parts made up of different animals. Each part of a chimera you've experienced. The head of an elephant, or the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle. Yeah, exactly. So each bit of it you've experienced, but what you put together you haven't experienced. And so that is a sort of power of imagination at work there. But a couple of things about it. One is that Locke, is it Locke or Hume? I can't remember how the argument went. Basically argues that you can't believe in those things. You can't have the power of belief and conviction in the reality of something that is completely chimerical, actually. So in a sense, truth is putting ideas together in a way that you can believe in because of constant conjunction. You have to experiences that confirm it. All I want to say about that, though, is that in terms of what the imagination is, there's a famous dispute between Coleridge and Wordsworth on the power of the imagination, where Wordsworth talks about the imagination in those terms as the power of combining and recombining at will things you have experienced, things you know of, to produce new things. And Coleridge, who in many ways was far more philosophically sophisticated than Wordsworth, very well read in German idealism, argued, no, that's fantasy. Imagination goes way beyond fantasy and allegory and metaphor and things like that to actually create something new which had not been conceived before. And he called that the esemplastic imagination. Blake's point is that without that actual novelty, all you will do is that science and ideas would just move around in the same. I can't remember. I've got it here somewhere. He basically said you would just go around in the same dull, round circle over and over, and nothing new would ever be conceived. I'm good. Are we done with Hoswell? Because I'd like to.
Yeah.
I'd like to return to him in future. I mean, I've sort of mentioned on my Facebook page of the Traveller in the Evening that if anyone's interested, I might start a reading group around this thing. I just think it kicks off on lots of things. Why I was excited before I read the book was I think he's absolutely moving in the right direction. Whether he's moved very far in that direction or not, people can dispute. But this attempt to use Blake to put God back in the picture of godless science and therefore underwrite not just truth as a one-off phenomenon, the truth of this or that proposition, but the pursuit of truth. I think he has lots of nice formulations in there actually peppered around that are very, very good descriptions of how that might work in a Blakean kind of conception.